So, before we really get into the weeds today, I just want to give a quick heads up to you listening. What you're about to hear is actually an AI-generated deep dive.
Right, yeah. We're essentially a synthetic narrator voice, well, two voices breaking down a really specific original German transcript.
Exactly. And the source we are pulling from today is episode 219 of the German Mister Futsal podcast, which, by the way, is hosted by a pretty incredible trio. You have Sebastian Rauch, Dr. Daniel Weimar, and Christian Wilfelschneider.
And we're not just going to give a high-level summary. We are going right into a chronologically ordered, deeply analytical breakdown of their entire conversation. Because the stuff they cover is, well, it's honestly fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. Because usually when we talk about developing elite athletes, right, there's this expectation of absolute precision. It's like engineering. You put a kid in an academy, run them through these specific grass drills, and boom, out pops a superstar.
Which is a very comforting idea. We crave that kind of visible, categorized certainty.
Right. But then you step into the real world of traditional football soccer for a lot of people. And that beautiful, precise pathway is completely shattered. Every massive club on earth wants the next generational talent, but the secret ingredient isn't actually found on a giant grass pitch.
No, it's not. It's arguably being forged on a very small, hard, heavily confined wooden court.
And that paradox is our mission for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We are taking a magnifying glass to the whole world of futsal, the global ecosystem, the tension between its massive international popularity and, well, its local grassroots struggles in places like Germany.
Plus the actual behavioral economics of how niche sports are broadcast, and of course the intensely tactical nuances of the players themselves.
So keep this fundamental question in your head as we go. Yeah. How can a sport that directly produces the world's most elite technical football players completely struggle to get local German clubs to invest in their own youth?
It sounds like a massive market failure, honestly.
It really does.
Yeah.
But to understand the macro level stuff, we have to start micro. We have to look at how bizarrely interconnected the futsal community is, because it operates as this highly obscure niche, but also as a massive global village at the exact same time.
Yeah, the village mentality is incredibly real. And there's this story that Christian shares on the podcast that perfectly captures it. So Christian is a goalkeeper based in Mainz, Germany, and he just casually reveals that sitting in his closet right now is a pair of shorts belonging to Luan Müller.
Wait, like the Luan Müller?
Yes, the Champions League winner with Palma, the two-time futsal world goalkeeper, absolute global titan of the sport.
That is wild. And apparently Müller actually randomly follows their German podcast on Instagram, right?
He does, yeah. But the way Christian actually got those shorts is pure grassroots magic. It goes all the way back to the 2016 University World Cup in Brazil.
Oh, right, when Müller wasn't really a global superstar yet.
Exactly. He was just the backup goalkeeper for the Brazilian university squad, and Christian was playing for the German university team.
And the German guys showed up fully decked out in this premium Adidas gear, which the Brazilians were apparently obsessing over.
Yeah, they loved it. So after a match, they do a classic tunnel kit swap. Christian hands over his shiny German gear and gets Müller's shorts in return. He flies back to Mainz, tosses them in a drawer, and, thinks nothing of it.
And then fast forward a few years, and the random guy he traded with is hoisting the Champions League trophy.
It just highlights how incredibly small the degrees of separation are. You have this intimate camaraderie happening right alongside massive global stakes.
But that camaraderie is sharply contrasted with how the sport is actually consumed globally, right? Because the guys on the podcast started comparing viewership numbers. And it paints a pretty stark picture.
Oh, it's staggering. They were watching a South American Copa Libertadores match, which is essentially their Champions League.
Right.
It was a group stage match between Nacional from Uruguay and Colo-Colo from Chile. Just a random afternoon stream on YouTube. And it effortlessly pulls in over 4,000 live concurrent viewers.
Just people tuning in because it's high-level futsal. But then you compare that to the pinnacle of the German futsal Bundesliga.
Yeah.
You take a powerhouse, reigning champion team like Weilimdorf playing a massive domestic match, and they are fighting tooth and nail to break 400 viewers.
A literal factor of 10 difference for the exact same sport.
Yep.
But honestly, the true explosion isn't even in South America right now. It's happening in Indonesia.
Oh, yeah. A market of nearly 290 million people.
Mm-hmm.
And Futsal has just fundamentally penetrated the mainstream culture there.
The way they describe the atmosphere in Indonesia is incredible. They use the phrase NBA feeling.
I love that comparison.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about the crowd size, right? It's about the acoustic and visual proximity.
Yes, exactly. In traditional football, the crowd is separated by, a running track or these massive advertising boards. But in Indonesian futsal arenas, the crowd is practically spilling right onto the touchline.
Yeah, the acoustic pressure on the players, that sheer wall of noise in a closed space, it creates this sensory overload that translates unbelievably well to television.
And that boom went into overdrive when international superstars started going there. The real catalyst was Ricardinho.
Arguably the most famous futsal player of his generation. The guy is an absolute magician with the ball.
And when he signed with an Indonesian league, it wasn't just, a late career cash grab. It was an accelerant.
It's like if a massive global pop star, say Taylor Swift, just bypassed a traditional stadium tour and decided to play a year-long residency at a mid-sized theater in Jakarta.
That is a perfect analogy. It instantly shifts the cultural gravity of the entire industry. Suddenly the whole world is paying attention to the Indonesian league.
But you have to ask why it thrives in places like that, or South America, while totally languishing in Central Europe. And Daniel Weimar brings in his economic lens here, pointing heavily to the format.
Right, the Copa Libertadores model. He calls it a masterclass in lowering barriers to entry.
Because traditional European football tournaments drag on for 9 months, right? Teams flying back and forth across a massive continent. It's a logistical nightmare.
But the Copa Libertadores gathers 12 top teams into a single host city. In this specific tournament they discussed, they all converged on Carlos Barbosa in Brazil.
It creates this intense, highly condensed festival of futsal over just 1 week.
And the critical variable, the absolute key to their reach, is that the entire thing is broadcast in high quality, completely for free on YouTube.
No €30 monthly subscription, no annoying geo-blocking telling you it's unavailable in your country.
Exactly. If you have a smartphone, you are instantly sitting in the front row. They are treating the broadcast as a global marketing expense to build equity rather than trying to squeeze revenue out of it on day one.
Right. They want a kid in Berlin or a casual fan in Chicago to stumble on the stream, feel the energy of that crowd, and just become emotionally invested.
And the product they're marketing isn't just an entertaining game. It is literally the most efficient laboratory for human athletic potential on the planet.
Which brings us back to our big central paradox. Why should you, the listener, care about futsal? Because it's the ultimate incubator for the sport the entire world does care about, traditional football.
The crossover is totally undeniable at this point. The podcast frequently brings up what they call the Kilman effect.
Ah, Max Kilman, the English defender.
Right. He went from playing for the English national futsal team straight into the grueling, hyper-physical environment of the Premier League. He completely shattered the myth that futsal was just a casual hobby sport.
And the pipeline is only getting stronger. They brought up Taha Ali as well.
Yes, from Sweden. He was a core player for the Swedish futsal national team around 2018-2019, and now he's a dynamic winger for Malmö FF on grass and actively pushing for a spot on the Swedish national football squad for the World Cup.
You do not make that leap from a wooden court to World Cup qualifiers unless the biomechanical and cognitive skills transfer flawlessly.
You really don't, and massive traditional clubs are waking up to this. Look at Manchester United's Kobbie Mainoo. He spent his formative youth years developing through the Manchester Futsal Club.
He's been an absolute revelation in the midfield, but we really need to break down why this happens. Why does futsal forge better traditional footballers than traditional football academies do?
It basically comes down to space and physiology.
Yeah, because I think a lot of casual fans hear futsal and they just picture indoor soccer, kids kicking a bouncy yellow ball off the gymnasium walls.
Which is a huge fundamental misunderstanding. Futsal is played with strict boundaries. There are no walls to bail you out of a bad pass.
And the ball itself is different.
Incredibly different. It's heavier, and it has a specifically dampened bounce. It stays glued to the floor. And because the court is so confined, the physical demands are wildly different from grass.
Right. Traditional football is primarily an aerobic sport, punctuated by short anaerobic sprints. You sprint for a ball, and then you have like 40 seconds to lightly jog back into position and catch your breath.
You can hide on a massive grass pitch.
Exactly. You cannot hide in futsal.
It is a game of continuous, high-intensity, repeated sprints. The physical testing metrics they discuss are staggering. Players in top Brazilian and Spanish futsal leagues routinely shatter the physical testing benchmarks set by elite grass footballers.
Because they are basically playing in a constant state of oxygen debt.
Yes. The tactical systems require you to sprint to press the ball, immediately sprint backward to cover a rotation, and then explode forward on a counterattack, all within maybe 10 seconds.
Your muscles are just screaming.
The lactic acid pooling in the tissue of futsal players' lactate tolerance has to be astronomically high. They are actively training their bodies to perform complex, fine motor skills while deeply, deeply fatigued.
But honestly, it's not just the lungs that adapt. It's the brain. The cognitive adaptation is even more fascinating to me.
Oh, absolutely. On a grass pitch, if you receive the ball, a defender might be 5 or 10 meters away. You have a full second to look up, scan the field, weigh your options, and pick a pass.
But in futsal, if you take a full second to scan, you've already been tackled, the opponent has countered, and the ball's in the back of your net.
Right. The spatial confinement forces this hyper-acceleration of cognitive processing speed. Players learn that they have to continuously scan their environment before they even receive the ball.
They're mapping the geometry of the court in real time.
Anticipating the movement of teammates, planning their exact exit strategy in fractions of a second.
So when you take a player whose brain has been forcefully wired to operate at 200 miles per hour under immense physical pressure on a tiny court, and you drop them into the midfield of a traditional grass pitch.
The game essentially moves in slow motion for them. They look around and realize they suddenly have an ocean of space.
Right. The technical precision they needed to navigate a 2-meter gap in futsal makes navigating a 5-meter gap on grass feel completely effortless.
And that soul of the foot control, they learn to manipulate the heavy futsal ball. It translates to an almost magnetic first touch with a traditional soccer ball.
So knowing all of this, looking at the undeniable scientific and empirical evidence, you would assume that every single football academy on Earth would absolutely mandate futsal. It seems like developmental negligence not to use it.
It really does, which makes the situation currently unfolding in the German futsal league so incredibly baffling.
It's a phenomenal contradiction. The podcast guys break down this specific scenario with the German U19 national futsal team.
Yeah, so they're preparing for a major international tournament in Poreč, Croatia, and the coaching staff brings 22 elite youth players to a centralized training camp in Frankfurt with the brutal task of cutting the roster down to 18.
So 3 goalkeepers and 15 outfield players. Standard national team crucible stuff.
But Christian highlights a statistic that completely derails the narrative here. Out of those 22 kids, the absolute best young futsal talent in the entire country, only 8 of them actually play for a dedicated futsal club.
Wait, 8 out of 22.
Just 8. The vast majority of the national team is entirely disconnected from the domestic futsal league structure.
So where are they coming from?
They are being pulled directly from traditional grass football clubs, brought in purely on their raw, translatable talent, and asked to compete internationally against countries where futsal is basically a religion.
Why is there such a massive disconnect? If these kids are talented enough to represent the national team, why aren't the top futsal Bundesliga clubs snatching them up? If I'm managing Wellendorf, I want the best U19 players in my academy.
You would think so. But the domestic club managers are trapped in this brutal win-now paradigm. Developing a raw 18-year-old takes time. It takes immense patience.
Yeah, it means you have to be willing to lose games on a Tuesday night while that kid figures out the complex rotational defense of a professional league.
And club managers simply don't want to lose. So instead of investing in the local 18-year-old, they look abroad. They rely heavily on foreign legionnaires.
Which means importing highly polished, ready-made players from Brazil, Spain, or Eastern Europe. And, I understand the temptation. You parachute in a veteran Brazilian fixo, and suddenly your defense is impenetrable, and you are competing for a championship tomorrow.
It immediately raises the tactical floor of your team. But Daniel Weimar points out the devastating long-term economic consequence of this strategy. There is basically zero evidence of a 3-year plan in the German league.
Right, because when you hire a legionnaire, you aren't just paying a salary.
No, you are paying for international relocation, flights, housing in an expensive German city, daily living expenses. It is an incredibly capital-intensive way to run a niche sports team.
And it does absolutely nothing to build cultural equity in the actual local community.
That's the key. If you invest that exact same capital into local youth infrastructure, hiring elite youth coaches, securing consistent hall time, You build a sustainable pipeline.
Because an 18-year-old local kid already lives at home. He goes to the local university. You aren't paying his rent.
And more importantly, that local kid brings his parents, his friends, his university classmates to the stands to watch him play. He inherently builds the audience.
Yeah, a Legionnaire might score brilliant goals, but he doesn't bring 50 local paying fans with him to the arena.
Exact.
I see the economic logic, I really do, but I have to play devil's advocate for a second. Can we really blame the club managers?
How so?
Well, they're operating in a super fragile ecosystem. If they prioritize a 3-year development plan, lose a bunch of games, and get relegated, the club might financially collapse before year 3 even happens. The Legionnaires essentially ensure short-term survival.
Which is a very fair point.
So isn't it the job of the governing body to kind of force the issue?
And that is the exact debate they have on the podcast. Sebastian Rauch suggests a pretty heavy-handed top-down intervention from the DFB, the German Football Association.
Okay, what's his proposal?
He proposes a strict 6-month rule. The concept is that a talented youth player from a grass club can be called up to the futsal national team, experience the camps, wear the crest, all of that. But within 6 months of that call-up, the DFB mandates that the player must officially sign with a dedicated futsal club.
Oh, wow. Or else what? They strip them of their national team eligibility.
Precisely. It is a completely artificial market intervention. It forces the player to fully commit to the specific tactical demands of the sport.
And it forces the domestic clubs to actually make roster spots available for local youth, because the DFB is essentially handing them national caliber talent on a silver platter.
It's a fascinating idea, creating that artificial demand. But you can imagine the friction it would cause.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
You're telling a 17-year-old kid who dreams of playing for Bayern Munich on grass that he has to commit to a niche indoor league just to keep his youth international status. That's super risky.
It is. But if we follow the money, if we want clubs to stop buying foreign players and start building academies, they need sustainable revenue.
Right. And the primary engine for sports revenue isn't really ticket sales anymore. It's broadcasting rights.
Which transitions us perfectly from the tactical friction on the court to the economic friction in the boardroom. The DFB has recently attempted to solve this monetization puzzle by launching a proprietary broadcasting platform called DFB TV.
Right, the new platform. So the setup here is basically a subscription model. They're charging €5.99 a month to access all this niche content. So that includes futsal, the women's leagues, beach soccer, lower division matches.
Although it is bundled for free if you already have a premium subscription to major sports networks like Sky or DAZN.
Which, at first glance, consolidating your niche sports onto a single professional platform seems like a really smart modernization move.
It does, but Dr. Weimar uses this as an opportunity to deliver a brilliant critique based on the economic theory of consumption capital. And this is where the podcast conversation gets truly profound.
I found this concept staggering, because it perfectly explains why some cultural phenomena just explode overnight and others take literal generations to catch on. Break down how consumption capital actually dictates our viewing habits.
Okay, so the core premise is that sports, unlike other forms of media, do not possess immediate plug-and-play value. Dr. Weimar uses the analogy of a Netflix movie to explain it.
Okay, how so?
If you sit down on your couch, browse Netflix, and click on an action movie, within 3 minutes, you completely understand the stakes.
Right. There are good guys, there are bad guys, there are explosions.
Exactly. You derive immediate entertainment utility from the spectacle without needing any prior education or deep context.
It's purely passive consumption. The barrier to enjoyment is practically zero.
But a sport is an entirely different beast. To actually enjoy watching a sport, the viewer must first accumulate consumption capital.
Meaning what exactly?
A deep, internalized database of knowledge. You need to understand the obscure rules, recognize the tactical formations, know the historical bitter rivalries between the teams.
You need to know why a specific pass was brilliant or why the crowd is suddenly booing a specific referee decision.
Exactly. And you don't learn that instantly. You usually learn it through osmosis over years. It's your dad explaining the offside rule to you on a Sunday afternoon or arguing about a penalty call with your friends at a bar.
Consumption capital is heavily transmitted through community and family.
Right. So when the DFB takes futsal, a sport, where the general German public has almost zero consumption capital and locks it behind a $5.99 paywall, it creates a massive economic paradox.
Because my time as a consumer has an alternative utility.
Exactly.
Like if I have a free hour on a Saturday, I could pay $6 to watch a sport I don't really understand, where the rules confuse me and I don't know any of the players.
Sure.
Or I could use that exact same hour to go for a run, watch a movie I know I'll like, or watch a traditional football match where my consumption capital is already maxed out.
The guaranteed utility of your alternatives will always beat the friction of the new paywall.
So the paywall basically preaches exclusively to the choir. It extracts a small amount of revenue from the 400 hardcore fans who already love Weilandorf, but it acts as a concrete wall against the casual fan.
The casual fan who might have stumbled upon a free YouTube stream, watched for 10 minutes, and slowly begun to build their consumption capital.
It's the exact antithesis of the Copa Libertadores strategy we discussed earlier. South America gave away the product for free to build the capital. Germany is charging for the product before the capital even exists.
It's a tough spot. But Christian, looking at it from inside the sport, offers a very strong counter-argument to this. He believes DFB TV provides something desperately needed: psychological legitimacy.
Which is a valid point. For years, domestic futsal was relegated to chaotic, amateurish YouTube streams.
Yeah, or buried deep in the menus of generic sports sites right next to, like, amateur badminton and field hockey. It looked like a hobby.
But by building a high-definition, centralized platform that technically integrates with giants like DAZN and Sky, the DFB is signaling to the market that this is a premium professional product.
It's the classic dress-for-the-job-you-want strategy. If you present futsal in a sleek app environment, the subconscious bias of the consumer shifts. They start to view the athletes as professionals rather than just guys playing in a gymnasium on a weekend.
It's a brutal tightrope walk, though. Do you bleed money by giving it away to build an audience, or do you restrict the audience to build the brand's prestige?
It is the defining question that every niche sport is currently battling. But, while the executives debate the paywalls, the actual product on the court continues to evolve at a blistering pace.
Yeah, let's get back to the court. The final segment of the podcast is this really deep, loving deconstruction of the players who are pushing the tactical boundaries of the sport, despite all the structural chaos around them.
They did a Players of the Season broke down, but what I loved is how they used these specific players to explain the complex mechanics of the positions themselves.
Let's start with the foundation then, the goalkeeper, or the Torspieler.
So, if you bring your traditional grass football assumptions to a futsal goalkeeper, you are going to completely misread the game.
Because on grass, a goalie is basically just the last line of defense.
Right. But in futsal, the goalkeeper is the primary tactical engine of the entire system. Christian, being a keeper himself, estimates that the goalie dictates 60 to 70% of a team's total success.
That is an absurd burden of responsibility. Why is their impact so disproportionate?
It really comes down to the geometry of the court. Because the space is so small, when the goalkeeper pushes out of their penalty area with the ball at their feet, they immediately create a 5 versus 4 numerical advantage.
So they act as a deep-lying playmaker, initiating the attack.
Exactly. And defensively, because shots come from such close range and from such unbelievably tight angles, their positioning and reflex speed dictate the entire defensive structure of the team.
And the hosts were pretty unanimous in their praise for Philipp Pless from Weilandorf.
Oh, absolutely. They didn't just name him Player of the Season. They explicitly bestowed legend status upon him.
Which is high praise. And what's fascinating is that their reasoning went far beyond just his shot-stopping ability.
Right. Pless represents the ideal holistic club player. Yes, his technical ability to read the game and distribute the ball is elite, but they really highlighted his immense cultural impact.
Like what?
Well, this is a guy who finishes his own grueling professional training and then goes right over to coach the women's team.
Wow.
He works heavily with the youth academy, and on the court, he maintains this stoic, elite level of sportsmanship that basically sets the psychological tone for the entire arena.
But they contrasted him perfectly with Johnny Gerder from the club Liria.
Yeah.
If Pless is the stoic tactician, Gerder is absolute emotional chaos in the best way possible.
Gerder is a fascinating psychological profile on the court. He relies on sheer, volatile force of will.
He makes these impossible acrobatic saves and then just screams at his defense, pumping up the crowd.
Yeah, he can single-handedly drag a mediocre team to victory purely through emotional momentum. It proves that even within the strict tactical confines of futsal, there is still room for radically different personality types to absolutely dominate.
So moving slightly up the court, we hit the fixo, the anchor, the deep-lying defender.
The fixo is essentially the brain of the outfield. They are the last line of defense before the keeper, but they are also the first pass in transition. They have to process the entire court in real time.
The hosts praised players like Robert Lucic and Gabriel Oliveira for their dominance, but Sebastian Rauch's analysis of a player named Ako Osowski was just a masterclass in tactical appreciation.
It really was. He called Osowski a structure player, which might be the ultimate compliment for a tactician.
It is, because Osowski isn't the guy who is going to isolate a defender, do 3 rapid step-overs, and smash the ball into the top corner.
No, he won't make the viral Instagram highlight reels.
But his impact on the game's rhythm is absolute. He manipulates space through micro-movements. Explain how that works mechanically for the listener.
Okay, say the opponent is initiating a really aggressive high press. Osowski will take 2 deliberate rapid steps to his left. That micro movement forces the pressing defender to adjust their angle of approach by just a fraction of a degree.
Right.
But that tiny fraction of a degree opens up a passing lane right through the center of the court for a teammate. Osowski destroys the opponent's defensive structure completely off the ball. He is playing 3 moves ahead, dictating the geometry so his teammates can thrive.
Which perfectly brings us to the players who directly benefit from all that created space. The Alas. The wingers.
Right, these are the dynamic engines on the flanks. The Alas are defined by agility, explosive pace, and relentless one-on-one ability. If the Fixo is the brain, the Allah is the dagger.
They highlighted David Sindrick, noting his absolute technical brilliance, though they did mention he's a bit of a controversial figure.
Yeah, because he splits his focus. He prioritizes outside commitments, like playing in the celebrity-driven Icon League, over the grueling team building of the actual futsal season.
It's a very modern athlete dilemma, brand building versus team building. But then you look at a player like Fayassi.
Fayassi is the epitome of the lethal Allah. His mechanics in isolation are just terrifying for a defender. He uses rapid hip shifts and incredible sole-of-the-foot control to constantly unbalance his marker.
And in futsal, if an Allah beats you one-on-one on the flank, the entire defensive structure has to collapse inward to cover, which leaves players wide open at the back post. Fayassi exploits that isolation perfectly.
They also heavily praise Sorokin, who essentially strapped his entire team, HOT, to his back and carried them through the season through sheer individual output.
But I think the most fascinating tactical debate they had centered around the highest player up the court. The pivot. The target forward. Because this position is undergoing a massive, real-time evolutionary crisis.
It really is. The classic pivot is dying.
It is a radical shift in the sport's identity. To understand it, we kind of have to look at the Marquinhos archetype.
Right, Marquinhos was a legendary Brazilian pivot. And the classic role required a massive, physically imposing player who would just anchor themselves high up the court with their back to the goal.
The team would bypass the midfield entirely, fire the ball directly into his feet, and he would use his sheer mass to hold off a defender, shield the ball, and either turn for a powerful shot or lay it off to an overlapping Allah.
But playing that way requires a highly specific physical profile. You need immense upper body strength to hold off the defender, incredible touch to trap a heavy ball under pressure, and, crucially, the anaerobic endurance to then sprint 40 meters back on defense the moment possession is lost.
And the game has basically evolved past this, hasn't it?
It has. Modern defensive pressing systems are so sophisticated and so aggressively rotational that having a static, purely physical player parked at the top of the formation has become a fatal liability.
Because if the pivot stays static, the defense can easily set their shape and trap the ball. The modern game demands absolute fluidity.
Exactly. Every single player on the court must be able to seamlessly rotate through the fixo, ala, and pivot positions in a matter of seconds.
Which is why the hosts highlighted Carlos Neves from HSV as the blueprint for the future. Neves is basically the anti-classic pivot.
He is a highly adaptable, kinetic hybrid. He operates high up the court, but he refuses to stay anchored.
He will drop deep into the midfield to receive the ball, pulling the central defender way out of position. He will drift out to the wings, forcing a mismatch. He uses mobility, rather than sheer mass, to create structural confusion.
And what's wild is that this tactical evolution actually dictates the physical evolution of the athletes themselves. Daniel Weimar noted a fascinating physiological contrast when comparing that South American Copa Libertadores tournament to the European game.
Yes. This part blew my mind. He observed the physical build of the players on the Brazilian team, Magnus Futsal.
Right. Magnus still stubbornly employs a very traditional, highly structured 3-1 formation, which heavily relies on a dominant classic pivot.
And because of that specific tactical environment, The Brazilian players are incredibly robust. They possess these thick, muscular, highly physical frames. They're literally built to absorb and deliver impact in static, confined spaces.
But then when you watch the European leagues, where the fluid, highly rotational four-zil system is dominant, the players have a distinctly different profile.
They are leaner, lighter, built way more like traditional grass footballers.
Because they are optimized for continuous, high-speed cardiovascular output rather than static strength, the tactical philosophy of the region literally sculpts the bodies of the athletes.
It is a phenomenal observation. The environment fully dictates the adaptation. And as the sport continues to globalize, we are watching these distinct tactical and physiological branches just collide on the international stage.
We really are.
Well, we have covered an immense amount of territory today, moving all the way from the microscopic to the macroeconomic. We started by exploring the deeply intimate yet globally massive futsal village, tracing Luan Muller's shorts from a university gym to the Champions League.
And feeling the acoustic pressure of an Indonesian arena driven by the sheer cultural gravity of Ricardinho.
We examined the indisputable science of the futsal court as an athletic incubator. We saw how the cognitive demands of confined spaces and the brutal requirement for lactate tolerance forged players like Max Kilman and Taha Ali.
Gifting them the spatial awareness that makes the sprawling grass pitch feel like it's moving in slow motion.
But we also slammed headfirst into the baffling developmental paradox in Germany. We dissected the economic trap that forces club managers to rely on foreign legionnaires, sacrificing the 3-year development of local U19 talent for the immediate gratification of a Tuesday night victory.
Then we waded into the deep waters of sports economics with Dr. Weimar, analyzing how the DFB's attempt to legitimize the sport through a paywall might ultimately starve it of the consumption capital it desperately needs to grow organically.
And finally, we brought it back to the beautiful geometry of the court itself. We broke down how Philipp Pless dominates the 5v4 advantage from the goal line, how Osowski manipulates space with a single step,
And how the relentless rotational demands of modern pressing are killing the classic muscular pivot in favor of the fluid kinetic hybrid.
It is a sport operating at the absolute bleeding edge of athletic and tactical development, even as it fights for its basic economic survival.
It really is an incredible tension.
So here is what I want you to do. The next time you sit down to watch an elite Champions League football match on a Tuesday night, I don't want you to just follow the ball. I want you to watch the midfielders.
Right.
Watch how they receive a pass with a massive defender breathing down their neck. Watch the frequency of their visual scanning before the ball even arrives at their feet. Look at how they use the sole of their foot to freeze a defender in a tight pocket of space.
Because when you see that impossible technical precision, there's a very high probability that you are watching an athlete whose brain and whose incredibly fast feet were not forged on that pristine, massive grass pit.
They were forged under intense pressure, in absolute oxygen debt, on a tight, fast, unforgiving wooden futsal court.
And once you understand that mechanism, it completely transforms the way you consume the game of football.
It strips away the illusion and shows you the machinery. Which leaves me with one final deeply provocative question for you to ponder long after this deep dive ends.
Let's hear it.
As the empirical evidence becomes undeniable, as more and more traditional mega clubs realize that futsal is the ultimate cheat code for youth development, what is the end game for the sport itself?
That's the million-dollar question.
Will futsal eventually be swallowed completely whole by the traditional football industrial complex, reduced to nothing more than an indoor farm system used purely to harvest technical talent for the grass pitch?
Or will the sport, fueled by the rabid, independent cultures in South America and Indonesia, and driven by a new generation of broadcast accessibility, manage to assert its own unique identity, standing alone as a globally televised, financially independent juggernaut?
The battle between becoming a subsidiary and becoming an empire is the defining narrative for the next decade of the sport. The X-ray is clear. We know exactly how the superstar is built, but we have no idea who will ultimately control the factory.
It's going to be fascinating to watch unfold.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep analyzing the hidden structures behind the sports you love, keep challenging the obvious narrative, and we will catch you on the next one.